Here is a purple ink by Sailor Manyo Akebi. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. This is such a great purple, right at the edge of magenta. As a color, it is completely enjoyable, and I am so very happy to have tried it, and it's just been wow. Now, this has some tone variation by pen, and with every version just as good as the other. There's really good shading throughout. On premium paper, like the Tomoe River that I'm taking the notes on, there's some very noticeable gold sheen in the writing that I will try to remember in post to show now. Hopefully it shows. Sheening inks aren't normally my thing, but this is really awesome. And I really think it's a must try, at least a bottle's worth. The pen for today is a Lamy 2000. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a very nice purple on the page with no feathering and no spread. We do get some shading when you look at Caught the Rope on the second line, where the CAU starts a little bit lighter. Now, the beginning part of the G gets a little bit darker, and with that little bit darker is a little bit of sheen. Now, it lightens up through the G, but it's the downstroke again that shows some more darker tones, lightening up into the H, slightly darker on the T. The starts lighter and gets darker at the he, and the he part also shows some of that sheen. Rope starting lighter, working its way darker, also again showing some sheen. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading. Help, he shouted on the first line. Help starts lighter, works its way darker. That P, the exclamation point, both showing off some sheen. He, darker, sheening, shouted, lighter to darker. That D, much darker, really showing the sheen. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading. Look at snap pointer. Second line, the S is just a little bit darker than the N, and the second hump of the N a little bit darker. The A lightens up. Now, the first P is a little lighter, but in the loop and into that second P, much darker and showing some sheen. Lightening up through the ED, where the D, much darker and sheen. Pointer starts dark, works its way lighter at the N. At the T, it's dark and with the sheen, where the P didn't really have it. Lightens up a little bit on the E, darker on the R, also bringing back that sheen. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get very little shading. really. Looking at the stronger on the second line, it's the HE is a little bit darker than the T on the, but stronger is all one tone. And mostly what we're getting in the writing sample is all one tone with very little showing of any kind of shading as a result of the paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We will see some shading going on. Look at with me and on the second line. With starts lighter, works its way very dark on the TH, but while it's very dark, there is no sheen. The more absorbent nature of this paper has really eaten it up. Me, 2 letters, 2 tones, beautiful, and going from lighter to darker all the way through. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was on or with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine, really being a great performing ink here for some consistency. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades. No, it does not sheen. After, on the first line, where you see the AF is a bit lighter than the TE and the R lightens up a bit. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, showing that this is a much more opaque ink because it's holding the same color despite the tone of this paper. No feathering, no spread, not a ton of shading, but it is there. When you look at Beaufort, where the B is a bit darker than the O and the FU, that's right, darken up a little bit, and the R lightens, where and does start lighter, works its way darker at the D. Same with last, starting lighter, working its way darker to the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We don't get a boatload of shading, but we do get some. Take a look at boatload on the third line, where the B is a bit darker than the OA and the TL darken up a little bit so the OA can lighten again and the D does get darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get some shading that's not bad, but not really as well as it could be. Look at bad on the first line, where the B is darker than the A in the beginning of that D. The downstroke of the D does start to light or darken up. Will starts a little bit lighter on the WY, but both L's much darker. No sheen in this, as was with the last paper. The more absorbent paper really kind of eating it up. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading. I don't think as well as on the Clairfontaine, but it is definitely there. Take a look at another length on the first line where the AN are lighter than the O. The TH just a little bit lighter than that O was. lightening again into the ER. Length is mostly a lighter tone, but look underneath those two words at hook. Where it's mostly lighter does get a little bit darker at the K. We're not seeing any sheen in the shading areas here, though. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, not quite as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. Yes, we do get some shading, like high as he could on the first line, where the H is a little bit lighter than the I at the end, as is a lighter word in general. He is a darker word in general, where could shows the shading change throughout the word, starting lighter, working its way darker to the D, and once again, we're not getting that sheen here that we had on the Clairfontaine or on the Tomoe River that I took my notes with. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading. Look at said on the first line, where most of the word is a bit lighter of its tone, but the downstroke of the D is much darker. Same with the dot of the I. Get first word on the first line. The top of the G is darker than the bottom of the G. It stays lighter into the E and gets much darker at the T. Once again, we would ask about that sheen, but it's not here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, their number 15. Here is Diatramentis Pearl Violet. Here is J.R.R. Larmes de Cassis. Here is Monteverde Purple Mist. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get almost nothing for shading. We can spot a couple of areas that are just a little bit darker, but for the most part, this paper doesn't tend to let shading come through, so it's not really worth the fight here. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine, flatter and less lively than the Clairfontaine as well. Now, there's no feathering and there is no spread. There is some shading going on, especially when you look at the bank, or the far bank on the first line, where the is much darker than far. Far stays a pretty light tone. Bank starts as a nice mid-tone on the B, lightens up on the AN, and gets much darker at the K. But we're not expecting tons of shading really coming through with everything on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering and with no spread. There is more shading than what had shown up kind of on the extra fine, I guess. It's not a great amount of shading, but there is something here. Look at something on the second line where it's mostly a lighter tone, but on the H and the downstroke of the G, it definitely gets darker. Bad right next to it starts as a mid-tone on the B, lightens during the A into the D, but the up and downstroke of that D get much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Colorverse Sea of Tranquility.
Here is a gray shimmering ink by Pelican Edelstein Moonstone.
Here is a pink ink by Ackerman Gourmet Pens Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Sailor Manyo. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. Neither the feather or the spread are a major issue. It takes it up to about a medium, but I don't think it's the end of the world here. Now, we get no shading, but we do get a very beautiful tone on the paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. No. High feathers on high, the first word. It sprang water with mighty, all of it, really tiny feathers. The spread's there, but it takes it just under probably a broad. There is little bits of shading that show up, like the cross for the T of it on the first line, or the H of high on the first line. If you go and you were to look, I don't know, on the second line, mighty, you see the bottom of the G and the T are a little bit darker. I'm just hoping it doesn't bleed through, since it does give a little bit of shade. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, darker than it was on the extra font or on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering and there is spread. It's not bad. It's not something that would stop you from using it here. It just needs to be noted that it's there, so that maybe you write a little bit larger than I am here. No shading going on. Still a beautiful tone on the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get very minor ghosting. Really, I mean, the ink is not getting super dark, deep into the paper all the time, but it is, especially on that medium. I wouldn't write back here. You could have guessed if you really wanted to. I wouldn't. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
I certainly did struggle doing the back of the page on that 20-pound paper. I don't know what my problem was. The extra fine is the lightest tone. It gives good shading, and it even sheens in the writing sample, especially with the Clairfontaine. The medium is the darkest tone with the best shading and the most sheen coming through. The stub is just a little bit lighter than the medium, still great shading and still great sheen. So while this can be a dealer's choice, it was the wet medium, or maybe consider a wet broad, that really gives it its best tone, shading, and of course, sheen for those that want that.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.